Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsonya. Good morning, Adefemi. Welcome and join the all-female crew this morning.
Good morning.
Morning,
All ladies crew, I'm so happy. Good morning, Ayo, and good morning, Vimba. I hope you're both doing well, holding down the fort perfectly as usual. Let me tell you what is happening around the world. Now, in what was the first edition of the eagerly anticipated Senate confirmation hearings of President-elect Trump's nominees for the people he wants in his administration, we have former anchor Pete Hegseth. He was the first person, and he sat down in front of a grueling panel for 4 hours. He sat down in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and his entire performance was quite checkered. It was very animated from the outset, especially when it came to his opening statement, which was continually interrupted by protesters in the gallery. And it happened over and over again. He would start speaking, a protester would start shouting, they would be removed by the services there, the Capitol Police. There'd be a brief pause. Pete Hegseth would be given the floor again, and then a few seconds into his confirmation, a few more seconds into him speaking, especially delivering this opening statement, another protester would come out, and the process would start over and over again. So it was quite laborious when it came to that portion of the Senate confirmation hearing. But essentially, once we moved past that, it was quite a strenuous one. I do think people were always expecting this to be an hours-long process, and indeed he was continued to speak and to be asked questions, answering questions for 4 hours. That being said, when it came to questions about topics that he was uncomfortable about, he was quite dismissive, especially when it came to questions about his excessive drinking, accusations of alcoholism. He dismissed those as a smear campaign fashioned to foil his efforts to ascend and be confirmed as a Secretary of Defense. That being said, still on the topic of very tough questions, Senator Elizabeth Warren put to him the very controversial comments he had made about women in combat. Let's take a listen to their exchange.
So if you're confirmed as Secretary of Defense, you will oversee our military, including about 250,000 women who currently serve on active duty in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Space Forces, and the Marines. And I have serious concerns that your behavior toward women disqualifies you from serving in this role. So going back to January 2013, you told a Fox News interviewer that women in the military simply couldn't measure up to men in the military, saying that allowing women to serve in combat roles would force the military to lower the bar. June 2024, you said on Ben Shapiro's podcast, quote, "Women shouldn't be in combat at all." You suddenly have another description about your views of women in the military, and I just want to know, what changed in the 32 days that the song you sang is not the song you come in here today to sing?
Senator, the concerns I have and the concerns that many have had, especially in ground combat units, is that in pursuit of certain percentages or quotas, standards have been changed. And that makes the combat more difficult for everybody involved.
Let me make a suggestion about what happened in that 32 days. You got a nomination from President Trump. Now, I've heard of deathbed conversions, but this is the first time I've heard of a nomination conversion. And I hope you understand that many women serving in the military right now might think that if you can convert so rapidly your long-held and aggressively pursued views in just 32 days, that 32 days after you get confirmed, maybe you'll just reverse those views and go back to the old guy who said straight up, women do not belong in combat.
Well, so very controversial segment there between Elizabeth Warren and Pete Hegseth, who was confronted with his own words, essentially. And as you heard her say, what changed in these 30-some days? What made you go from saying that women have no place in combat, that you would have to lower standards, lower the bar for women, to you all of a sudden talking about how you don't think that women should be excluded and the like? And she put it to him that it's because he's been nominated and he's trying to confirm his nomination that actually he is a misogynist, as though she didn't use those words, the protesters used those words. But it was very, very colourful to see that exchange between the two of them. And it did go on for quite some time. Now, moving away from that, you can imagine that the Republicans, especially Trump's administration, were quite happy with Pete Hegseth's performance. They said that he did a great job during his Senate hearing. And again, they are looking forward to inauguration, which will take place on the 20th of January, which is this coming Monday. So as we move from one president coming in, let's move over to South Korea, where another president has been impeached and now has been detained. We're talking about the impeached president Yoon Suk Yeol, who has now been apprehended by police. You'll remember that we talked about a standoff being taking place on the grounds of the presidential residence because there had been a warrant out for his detention, warrant out for his arrest, linked back to his declaration of martial law. That short-lived declaration, we know, killed his presidential career and led to him being impeached. And there still, as a byproduct of that action, there is still the issue with investigators and police wanting to speak to him in custody. Now, as we said, there had been a standoff that took place between investigators, police, and also his supporters. And then when we were talking about the actual physicalities of police being able to enter the residence, they were blocked by crowds of supporters, but also vehicles, which led police and investigators to use ladders to enter the presidential compound. Now, there was a video that was released shortly after his detention. It was a pre-recorded one where the impeached president discussed that he had made the decision to hand himself over to authorities to avoid any further bloodshed, or to avoid bloodshed at all when it comes to this political crisis befalling him. So we will continue to keep our eyes open and listen to what is coming out of his detention. As it stands now, the corruption police have the ability to keep him in detention for 48 hours. Thereafter, they will have to formally apply for an extension. So we will see whether or not he will be released within this first 48-hour period, whether he'll be kept longer, and whether or not they will follow the due process, which is applying for longer time should they see fit. Now, from South Korea, let's come here to the United Kingdom, where the Treasury Minister, a woman by the name of Tulip Siddiq, has resigned from her post yesterday. She had been facing growing calls to resign, a lot of criticism centered behind her family background and her position in this Labour government. Now, a lot of this issue starts with, again, accusations of corruption, of her perhaps colluding or having unnecessary ties with the Bengali government. This is because she is the niece of the ousted Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, something that she has not denied. And it is important to make clear that though she has resigned, when an internal investigation was taking place, it was revealed to Keir Starmer that she had not done anything wrong, that whatever explanations she had given them were satisfactory, and that they didn't recommend she lose her job or anything of the sort. However, Sir Keir Starmer was also advised that he should consider her responsibilities in the future, which is very British veiled language for she didn't do anything wrong. We can't prove that she did anything wrong, but you might want to distance yourself from her because this noise is getting plenty. And so essentially that's what she's done. She said she's resigned because the distraction was becoming too much. But this distraction, as I said, hinges back to two properties. One is a 2-bedroom property in North Central London in King's Cross, which she lived in, which is lived in by her family, lived in with her. And it is believed that the owner of that property is a businessman who has ties to the ousted government. And then there's also the property she lives in now, also owned by a family member or a close family friend who is a business person from Bangladesh with ties to this government. So it's the optics essentially that people felt uncomfortable with. Why is it that somebody within her constituency has the ability to live in her own home? Why is she living in these, I don't want to call them luxurious, but in these properties that are not fully owned by her, but owned by people with clear and explicit links to an ousted government? So those are the stories from our World Brief. Love to hear your thoughts before we move on to the newspapers.
All right, Adefemi, oh my goodness. I was glued to my screen yesterday for the screening of Pete Hegseth. Wow. Now, that's what you call a screening. That, first of all, that was my first reaction is I just thought, God, when will we see some of these things closer to home? But apart from that, it was extremely brutal. I mean, it was no holds barred. All gloves were off. They spoke about his personal life. Of course, he's a divorcee. I believe he's on his second marriage. And there was the whole scandal around how he had cheated on his first wife just 2 months after his daughter was born. They even asked about the daughter. So there were no boundaries. He was also asked if he was given illegal instructions from Donald Trump, whether he would execute those instructions. So he was really on the hot seat. But generally, I thought he was extremely composed. I thought he was able to express himself without being too ruffled. Even when there were those protesters who were screaming and so forth, he was able to just maintain a very composed nature, which is a point to him. Now, the general consensus, my takeaway is that the last Secretary of Defense was a 5-star General, Lloyd Austin, and he is the complete opposite. By the time he retired, I believe he was a major. So yes, he is a veteran, but he was extremely low ranking in the army. And this, what stuck out to me was the question posed to him, because one of the senators asked him about why he feels that generals who have just retired shouldn't be allowed to hold military contracts for at least 10 years. And for me, that was a highlight, because it made me realize that the real issue here is that Donald Trump does feel that there's some sort of collusion happening with retired military men and the defense contracts and the cartel that has been formed around the American defense industry. So he's bringing this complete outsider who's, kind of naive, if we may call it that. And I think that's the plan. The plan is to just bring somebody who can execute Trump's agenda without the defense cartels that that are always spoken about, and move it forward. Will he be sober? We hope he will, and hopefully there won't be any more scandals around sexual assault and all of that. So looking forward to seeing the outcome of that screening.
All right, so let me stay in the United States of America, because that was 4 hours grilling. And like you said, that is what a Senate confirmation should look like, where you ask very important questions, even though some criticisms have come out that the pertinent questions around how he would manage the complexities of the military wasn't the focus. Rather, they focused more on his character, on his past, on the scandals that have followed him, including his drinking, even though he had assured Americans that he would not be drinking on the job. And of course, the 2017 scandal with the woman in the hotel, which came up after his nomination by President Donald Trump. And so the Democrats came ready to fire. And at the end, many of them said that they didn't think he was able to convince them that he was the man for the job. He had a lot of convincing to do. Like you already highlighted, Vimba, he's going to be walking in very big shoes, or he has very big shoes to fill following the last Secretary of Defense. Now, that position is a very important and strategic position in the United States of America. As the Secretary of Defense, he will be the head of the executive arm of the military, of the U.S. military, which is the Department of Defense. And he will only be second in rank or in terms of command chain to the president, who is the commander-in-chief. So you can understand, in terms of the level of responsibility he has and why this was quite rigorous. And the fact that some people have, criticized President Donald Trump's choice of a man whom they feel might not be competent, aside from his personal character, even in terms of his ability or experience in managing complex and large teams. At best, he's only managed, a few hundreds of people, and here he's going to be managing the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Space Force, and so many others. So that came into question, and unfortunately, even though, yes, in some instances he responded quite well, many of them weren't quite convinced. Remember, finally, I'll say this, that the U.S. military is made up of 16% of women, and that's why that conversation around women being combat, soldiers was quite important. He himself, as a combat veteran, would speak based on what he had seen on the field. But I think it's important that, we see just how people are able to get out information from potential candidates who will take on very important roles, and then see from their responses whether or not they are fit for the job, and not just to take a bow and move.
Thank you both very much. I'm hoping you can hear us. I know that sometimes it's raining in London now. We're having some issues, but I'm hoping you can see me, hoping you can hear me. Yes, but thank you both for your great analysis when it comes to the World Brief stories. Great, wonderful, we're winning, ladies, the winning women. All righty, let's move on to the newspapers this morning. Let's move on and take a look at the front page of This Day. Now, This Day talks about a lot of different stories as usual, but one of the stories that first jump out is looking at the acquisition now of 255 out of the 2,000 tractors within a private deal between Nigerian government and it is believed a private company in Brazil. Nigeria has now received 255 of the trucks that they are expecting to be able to hand out and distribute to farmers across the nation. This is all in the federal government's efforts to combat food inflation, which, as we know, has reached 34%. So hopefully you can imagine that this will go some way to addressing that concern. That is definitely the position from the federal government for now. But another story which is of course on the front page of This Day, as is the case with a lot of other Nigerian papers this morning, is the latest in the dispute between General Hydrocarbons Limited, GHL, and First Bank. Now, essentially, the latest turn that we are seeing, according to the newspaper reports, looks at a response by GHL towards another round of information released by First Bank. So in response to what First Bank have said, First Bank said that GHL had taken crude from a storage vessel and then diverted the proceeds. That is an example of the behavior from GHL which they are trying to distance themselves from, which they're trying to get to the bottom of. However, in response, if you look and read the front page article on This Day and in other newspapers, GHL actually say that the monies from First Bank that should have come to address critical issues didn't come, that they would either come perhaps up to 70 days late or not come at all, that forced them to seek a third-party arrangement to acquire funds in order to pay for critical resources needed for the people working on this offshore rig, food, water, and other critical resources. GHL is saying that essentially that is the diversion that First Bank are accusing them of. So again, there's a lot of back and forth between two evident titans in their respective industries going head to head again in this very controversial issue. So we will continue to keep you up to date with this story, but essentially, just to reiterate, GHL say that the diversion that First Bank are accusing them of links back to them having to enter into a third-party agreement in order to secure the funds they needed to pay for the supplies which their staff, the people working on this oil rig, desperately needed. Now, moving on from This Day this morning, let's move on to the New Telegraph. And the New Telegraph focused on Nigeria's Chief of Defence Staff, Christopher Musa, who says that the arrest of Simon Ekpa by the Finnish government has helped to reduce tension in the southeast. Now, Mr. Musa did make this claim while appearing before the House of Representatives Committee on Defence to defend the budget of his armed forces. The Ministry of Defence has also demanded 20 billion naira for the families of deceased personnel. Now, staying with the theme of armed forces, today is of course Armed Force Remembrance Day, and The Guardian leads with the call for better equipment, compensation and prosecution of terrorists being top of agenda on this Armed Forces Remembrance Day. To this effect, you do have Minister of State for Defence Bello Matawale saying that he has told lawmakers that the proposed 50 billion naira budget for the ministry in 2025 is too small, grossly inadequate to address the country's security challenges. Now, moving on to the Daily Trust this morning, and the Daily Trust joins a host of Nigerian papers to report on the Central Bank of Nigeria fining 9 Nigerian banks to the tune of 150 million naira each for failing to make naira notes available through ATMs during the festive period. The affected banks include Fidelity, First Bank, Keystone, Union Bank, Globus, Providus, Zenith, UBA and Sterling Bank. Those are the 9 banks who have been fined 150 million naira. Now, to the three of us, 150 million naira is a lot of money, but perhaps not to these banks. We'll see. Now, moving on from the Daily Trust, let's look at the Punch this morning. And the Punch looks at Naomi Shilekunla, who is among the people which include Oriyomi Amzat, as well as the principal of the Islamic High School, Bashir Abdullahi Fasasi. see, they've all been bailed from prison, the Agodi Correctional Center in Oyo State, on Tuesday. Now, this is because all three of them had been able to secure bail to the tune of 10 million naira each. And this is, of course, 21 days after they were remanded in prison for their involvement in a stampede. And then finally, if we move on to the Daily Express of the United Kingdom, we do have Catherine, the Princess of Wales, expressing her gratitude to the healthcare services as she says that her cancer is now in remission. These are the newspapers from around the world this morning.
Thank you so much for that, Adefemi. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but listen, I'm glad the banks have been fined because the non-availability of cash is just selfish and unfair, and I hope that now we will be able to access some cash from our ATMs. All right, thank you so much, Adefemi Akinson.